Hey everyone. Tonight, we're diving into the shadowy depths of one of the most complex and enigmatic figures in all of Star Wars lore, the story of Traya, the woman who would become Darth Traya. Her ultimate ambition wasn't to rule the galaxy, but to commit the most impossible act ever conceived, to murder the Force itself. Before we begin this epic journey, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I've noticed that about 86% of you watching regularly haven't subscribed yet, and honestly, your subscription is what keeps this channel alive. It allows me to keep bringing you these deep dives into the stories we all love. Also, if you're fascinated by tales of political intrigue and betrayal, check out my new channel, The Raven's Tales, where I explore the dark and twisted world of Game of Thrones. The link is right there in the description, and I'm genuinely curious, are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Drop a comment below. There's something magical about knowing we're all sharing this story together, no matter how far apart we might be. Now get comfortable, dim those lights, and let's journey into a tale that spans decades of manipulation, betrayal, and philosophical awakening. In the crumbling stone corridors of Malachor V, an old woman stood before her former student, her eyes burning with terrible knowledge. "You were meant to be my greatest failure," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's bitter wisdom. Around them, the dark side saturated every stone, every breath, every heartbeat. But this wasn't the end of her story. This was the culmination of a plan so audacious, so utterly impossible. It would reshape the very nature of existence itself. How had Traya, once a respected Jedi Master, fallen so far that she would seek to destroy the very foundation of life in the galaxy? What drove this brilliant teacher to betray everything she once held sacred? And why did she believe that the greatest act of mercy she could perform would be to free all living beings from the Force's eternal manipulation? The answers lie buried in decades of carefully orchestrated deception, in lessons taught through pain, and in a philosophy so dangerous that both Jedi and Sith would unite to stop her if they truly understood what she intended to accomplish. To understand the woman who would become Darth Traya, we must first step into the galaxy as it existed in those turbulent times, nearly 4,000 years before the rise of the Empire. This was the era of the Old Republic, when the Jedi Order stood at the height of its power and influence, yet carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The Republic stretched across countless star systems. Its golden age was slowly giving way to the shadows of approaching war. On Coruscant, the towering spires of the Jedi Temple reached toward the clouds, housing thousands of Jedi Knights and Masters who served as guardians of peace and justice. Among the most respected teachers in those hallowed halls was a woman, known simply as Traya. Master Traya wasn't like the other Jedi, where her peers sought harmony and consensus. She thrived on challenging comfortable assumptions. Her reputation as a teacher was both revered and controversial, for she believed that true wisdom could only emerge through struggle, through questioning everything one had been taught to accept without examination. Her students weren't just trained in lightsaber combat and Force techniques. They were forged in the fires of philosophical debate and moral complexity. The Academy on Tatooine, with its crystal caves and rolling grasslands, became her preferred teaching ground. Away from the rigid protocols of the Coruscant Temple, Traya could shape young minds in ways that made more traditional masters deeply uncomfortable. She taught that the Force wasn't the benevolent guide Jedi doctrine proclaimed it to be, but something far more complex and potentially dangerous. To her students, she posed questions with no easy answers. If the Force guides all things, what room is there for free will? If we're all connected through this cosmic energy, are we truly individuals, or just puppets dancing to a greater design? Among her most promising students were two young men whose names would echo through galactic history. Revan and Aliku would later take the name Malak. Revan possessed a brilliant strategic mind and an insatiable curiosity about the nature of the Force itself. He questioned everything, much like his teacher. But where Kriya's questions led her toward philosophical contemplation, Revan's drove him toward action. Alec was different, passionate and loyal, with a warrior's heart that beat in rhythm, with righteous fury. Together, they formed the core of a generation of Jedi that Kriya hoped would transcend the limitations she saw in the Order. But even as she taught them, darker forces were stirring beyond the Republic's borders. The Mandalorian clans, under the leadership of Mandalore, the Ultimate, had begun their systematic conquest of worlds along the Outer Rim. These weren't mere raiders or pirates, but a warrior culture that had turned the art of war into something approaching religious devotion. Their Beskar armor gleamed like silver death in the light of burning worlds, and their discipline was absolute. The Mandalorian wars, as they would come to be known, presented the Jedi Order with a terrible dilemma. The Republic's military forces were being systematically dismantled by Mandalorian tactics. Worlds were falling one by one. Millions cried out for salvation. Yet the Jedi Council, led by Master Vrook, Lamar, and others, chose to wait and meditate, seek guidance from the Force before committing to action. It was this decision, this moment of hesitation in the face of galactic suffering, that planted the first seeds of doubt in Kriya's mind. How could beings who claimed to serve justice stand idle while civilizations burned? How could guardians of peace justify inaction when their intervention could save countless lives? The political landscape of the Republic itself was fracturing under the strain. Chancellor Tal Kressa struggled to maintain unity among systems that questioned whether the Republic could protect them. Some worlds began to consider surrender to the Mandalorians. Others begged the Jedi for help that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. In the Senate chambers on Coruscant, debates raged. Senator after senator rose to demand action, to plead for the deployment of Jedi forces, to question why the Order that had served the Republic for 1,000 generations now seemed paralyzed by indecision. But the Jedi maintained their stance, trusting in the Force to reveal the proper path in its own time. Meanwhile, in the outer systems, another figure moved in the shadows, one whose influence would prove crucial to the unfolding tragedy. The being known only as the Sith Emperor had begun to take notice of the chaos consuming the galaxy. From his hidden empire beyond the known regions, he set in motion plans to manipulate both sides of the conflict for his own dark purposes. Kriya watched it all unfold with growing unease. Her students grew restless, torn between duty to the Order and compassion for the suffering masses. In the Academy's meditation chambers, she found herself questioning not just the Council's decisions, but the very nature of the Force that supposedly guided them. If the Force truly sought balance and harmony, why did it allow such widespread destruction? If it was wise and benevolent, why did following its guidance lead to such moral paralysis? These questions tormented her in the quiet hours between lessons, as she walked the moonlit paths of Dantuan and felt the weight of her students' expectations pressing down on her shoulders. She had taught them to question, to think independently, to seek truth even when it was uncomfortable. Now, that very teaching was leading them toward a decision that would challenge everything that Jedi Order stood for. The stage was set for a tragedy that would reshape the galaxy, in the tension between action and inaction, between compassion and wisdom, between the demands of the heart and the dictates of ancient tradition. The fate of countless beings hung in the balance. And at the center of it all stood Kriya, master teacher and unwitting, architect of galactic catastrophier, about to learn the first of many bitter lessons about the true nature of the force she had devoted her life to serving. The corridors of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant had witnessed the rise of countless force wielders, but few possessed the raw intellectual hunger that drove young Kriya in her earliest years of training. Her mind operated like a precision instrument, dissecting every lesson, every principle, every sacred teaching of the Order with surgical clarity. Where other Padawans accepted the wisdom of their masters with grateful reverence, she subjected every piece of knowledge to rigorous examination, searching for flaws in logic, gaps in understanding, and unquestioned assumptions that might conceal deeper truths. Her master, Aran Kai, was herself considered somewhat unconventional by council standards. A woman of Ekani heritage, whose combat skills were matched only by her philosophical curiosity. Kai recognized in her student a reflection of her own rebellious nature, amplified to an almost dangerous degree. During their private training sessions in the temples, ancient meditation chambers, she found herself both thrilled and troubled by the depth of Kriya's insights. The code speaks of there being no emotion, yet emotion is what drives beings to seek justice. Kriya observed during one such session, her young face serious. Beyond her years, it tells us there is no ignorance, yet we are constantly discovering new aspects of the Force that our predecessors never understood. Are we to believe that truth is static, that wisdom cannot evolve? These questions revealed a mind that refused to accept comfortable simplicities. Even as a Padawan, Kriya demonstrated an uncanny ability to perceive the psychological foundations underlying any belief system or social structure. She could look at a group of beings and instantly understand the hidden dynamics of power, fear, desire, and insecurity that truly governed their interactions, regardless of whatever noble principles they claimed to follow. This talent first dramatically manifested during a mission to the mining world of Perigus. The facility had been plagued by a series of accidents threatening to shut down fuel production vital to the Republic's defense efforts. The official investigation blamed aging equipment and worker negligence, but Kriya sensed deeper currents. At work, while her master met with administrators, Kriya spent time among the miners listening to their complaints, fears, and whispered conversations during shift changes. Within days, she uncovered a web of sabotage orchestrated by a small group secretly influenced by Mandalorian agents seeking to disrupt Republic supply lines. The revelation might have been victory enough for most Padawans, but Kriya was disturbed by how easily she had manipulated the miners into revealing their secrets. She hadn't used force persuasion, just a deep intuitive understanding of what each person needed to hear to open up. She had become a perfect mirror, reflecting back each individual's deepest needs and desires. This ability to see through surface appearances to the motivations driving behavior became her greatest strength. Her lightsaber skills were adequate, her force techniques competent, but her psychological insight was unmatched. Her early promotion to Jedi Knight was due in part to this talent and, in part because some council members hoped the responsibilities of knighthood might help channel her rebellious tendencies. She was assigned to the Dantuan Enclave ostensibly to learn patience and humility through service to agricultural communities. The crystal caves beneath the enclave became her sanctuary. The living crystals resonated with the Force in ways that made meditation easier and far more intense. It was during one of these deep states that Kriya had her first true glimpse behind the veil of reality. The Force, as she perceived it, wasn't the benevolent guide described in Jedi teachings. It was far more complex, perhaps even sinister. She felt its influence flowing through every being, shaping thoughts, emotions, and decisions in ways so subtle that most never realized they were being manipulated. Free will, she realized, might be nothing more than a comforting illusion. But instead of despairing, she responded with determination. If the Force was manipulating all life, perhaps beings could learn to recognize and resist that manipulation. The key, she reasoned, lay in education and self-awareness. Her first chance to test this came with her Padawan, a young Zabrak named Cyan whose raw power was matched only by his emotional volatility. Traditional methods had failed with him. Most masters thought he should be dismissed entirely. Kriya saw his struggle not as a flaw but an opportunity. Instead of suppressing emotion, she taught him to understand and channel it. Instead of demanding blind obedience, she encouraged him to question the code's purpose. The transformation was remarkable. Cyan's passion became a source of intense focus. His understanding of the Force deepened. Word of her success spread and other problem students were sent to Dan Tuan, Jedi seen as too aggressive, too independent, or too questioning. Each one gave her a new opportunity to refine her methods. She learned to guide students toward specific revelations while letting them believe they had arrived there on their own. She created carefully designed scenarios that forced confrontations with uncomfortable truths. Her results were undeniable, but deeply alarming to some in the Jedi Council. Master Atreides, in particular, grew concerned that Kriya was teaching students to manipulate others, the same way she manipulated them. The distinction between education and indoctrination, Atreides argued, was becoming dangerously blurred. These criticisms stung, partly because Kriya recognized their validity. She was, indeed, manipulating her students, albeit with what she believed were their best interests at heart. But this realization led her to an even more troubling question about the nature of teaching itself. Was all education simply a form of manipulation, whether acknowledged or not? And if so, was honest manipulation more ethical than the kind that pretended to respect student autonomy while actually constraining it within acceptable boundaries? The arrival of Revan and Alec as her students marked the beginning of her most ambitious experiment in alternative Jedi education. These two young men possessed not only exceptional Force sensitivity, but also brilliant strategic minds and natural leadership abilities. In them, she saw the possibility of creating Jedi who could transcend the limitations of traditional training entirely, who could think and act with complete independence, while still serving the cause of justice and peace. The holographic displays in the Dantuan Enclave's communication center painted a picture of systematic devastation that grew more comprehensive with each passing day. Entire star systems flickered and went dark as Mandalorian fleets advanced through the Outer Rim territories with methodical precision. What had begun as isolated raids on remote worlds had evolved into something far more threatening, a coordinated campaign of conquest that seemed designed not merely to expand Mandalorian territory, but to test the very foundations of Republic civilization. Kriya stood before these displays during the quiet hours before dawn, studying the tactical patterns with the same intensity she once reserved for ancient philosophical texts. The were not simply conquering worlds. They were systematically dismantling the cultural and economic networks that bound the Republic together. Trade routes were severed, communication relays destroyed, and entire populations either enslaved or else scattered as refugees. The strategic implications were clear to anyone with sufficient military knowledge. But what disturbed Chrysia more deeply were the psychological aspects of the Mandalorian approach. Their leader, known only as Mandalore, the Ultimate, had crafted a campaign designed to exploit fundamental weaknesses in both the Republic's military doctrine and the Jedi Order's philosophical foundations. Every move seemed calculated to force difficult moral choices upon their enemies. Her students had begun gathering intelligence independently, using their growing network of contacts throughout the galaxy to supplement the official reports reaching the Enclave. Revan's analytical mind had identified patterns in Mandalorian tactics that suggested access to highly classified Republic strategic documents. Someone with intimate knowledge of Republic defensive capabilities was feeding information to the enemy. But the Jedi Council seemed either unwilling or unable to acknowledge this possibility. Alec's temperament made him less suited to intelligence analysis, but more capable of understanding the psychological impact of the war on individual systems and populations. His reports described entire worlds paralyzed by terror, their governments unable to decide whether to resist and face annihilation or surrender and accept Mandalorian rule. The Republic's promise of protection rang hollow when that protection was contingent upon decisions made by Jedi Masters meditating in distant temples. These developments forced Chrysia to confront uncomfortable truths about the organization she had served faithfully for decades. The Jedi Council's decision to remain neutral while conducting lengthy consultations with the Force appeared wise and measured when viewed from the serene meditation chambers of Coruscant, from the perspective of worlds facing imminent invasion. However, it seemed like cowardice disguised as spiritual discipline. Her private communications with other Jedi Masters revealed a growing schism within the Order itself. Younger Knights and recently elevated Masters increasingly questioned the wisdom of inaction in the face of such clear aggression. Older, more traditional members of the Council maintained that hasty intervention without proper understanding of the Force's will could lead to catastrophic consequences for the galaxy as a whole. Master Kavar, whose wisdom Chrysia had long respected, sent encrypted messages describing heated debates within the council chambers. The traditional faction, led by Masters Vrook Vandor and Atrice, argued that the Mandalorian threat was itself part of some larger pattern that would only become clear through patient observation and meditation. Premature action, they insisted, could disrupt the Force's natural movement toward balance and resolution. The opposing viewpoint, championed by younger council members like Master Kavar himself, held that the Force worked through the actions of living beings rather than in spite of them. If the Jedi possessed the power to stop unnecessary suffering, they had a moral obligation to act regardless of whatever cosmic balance might be at stake. The debate had grown so intense that several Masters had ceased speaking to one another entirely. This philosophical crisis within the Order's leadership created opportunities for Chrysia to explore her own evolving understanding of the Force and its relationship to moral action. Her students had begun to see her not merely as a teacher, but as a voice of clarity in a galaxy consumed by confusion and indecision. They came to her private chambers seeking guidance, not just on lightsaber techniques or force manipulation, but on fundamental questions about duty, loyalty, and the nature of righteous action. During one such gathering, as reports arrived of the fall of Soko and the massacre of its 4 billion inhabitants, one student posed the question that had been haunting them all. Master, if the Force truly seeks balance and harmony, why does it permit such wholesale slaughter? Are we to believe that the deaths of innocents serve some higher purpose that we are too limited to understand? The question struck at the heart of Chrysia's own doubts about Jedi doctrine. She had spent years teaching her students to think independently, to question comfortable assumptions, to seek truth even when it challenged established authority. Now, those same lessons were leading them toward conclusions that put them in direct opposition to the Jedi Council's will. Her response that evening would later be remembered by her students as the moment when their beloved teacher began her transformation into something else entirely. Perhaps, she said, her voice carrying a weight of contemplation that bordered on heresy. The Force is not the benevolent guide we have been taught to revere. Perhaps it is something more complex, more morally ambiguous than our simple categorizations of light and dark can encompass. This suggestion opened floodgates of theological speculation that had been dammed up behind years of orthodox training. If the Force was not inherently good, then serving its will might not automatically align with moral righteousness. If the Jedi had been wrong about the fundamental nature of their guiding principle, then perhaps they had been wrong about other things as well. Revan, whose strategic mind thrived on complex problems, began developing scenarios in which Jedi intervention could end the Mandalorian threat swiftly and decisively. His plans were brilliant, ruthless, and completely at odds with the Council's preference for defensive action. When he presented these strategies to Chrysia, she found herself unable to identify significant flaws in his reasoning. The military situation continued to deteriorate while the Jedi meditated. Mandalorian forces had begun probing attacks against mid-rim systems, testing Republic defensive capabilities and measuring response times. Their tactics showed intimate knowledge of Jedi combat doctrine, suggesting that they had developed specific countermeasures for Force wielders. Intelligence reports from the few survivors of conquered worlds painted a disturbing picture of Mandalorian occupation policies. They were not simply taking territory and resources, but actively working to destroy the philosophical and cultural foundations of Republic civilization. Libraries were burned, universities closed, and entire intellectual traditions vanished under the systematically applied brutality of warrior rule. Chrysia recognized in these reports evidence of something that chilled her more than mere military conquest. The Mandalorians seemed to understand that their true enemy was not the Republic's military forces, but the ideas and values that held Republic society together. They were waging war not just against armies and fleets, but against the concept of civilization itself. This realization crystallized her growing conviction that the Jedi Council's passive response was not merely strategically inadequate, it was morally catastrophic. By refusing to act, the Order was essentially collaborating in the destruction of everything they claimed to protect. Their meditation and soul-searching were luxuries purchased with the blood of beings they had sworn to defend. The final catalyst came with news of the Mandalorian assault on Alta. The agricultural world had sent desperate pleas for aid as enemy fleets approached, begging the Jedi to remember their ancient promises of protection. The Council's response had been to assign a single Jedi consular to evacuate selected cultural artifacts and historical documents before the inevitable fall. When the reports arrived describing Althea's final hours, Chrysia felt something fundamental shift within her understanding of the Force, the Jedi, and her own moral obligations. the systematic extermination of an entire planetary population while Jedi Masters debated theological fine points, represented a failure so complete that it called into question the very foundations of everything she had believed about the nature of good and evil in the galaxy. The breaking point arrived not with dramatic revelation, but through gradual erosion of faith like water, wearing away stone until a mighty foundation crumbles without warning. Chrysia had watched her most promising students depart for war against the explicit orders of the Jedi Council, their faces bearing expressions of grim determination that reminded her painfully of her own younger self. Revan and Alec had chosen action over contemplation, compassion over obedience, and in doing so had revealed the fundamental bankruptcy of the philosophical system she had spent her life serving. Their departure left her alone in the crystal caves beneath Dantwan, surrounded by the living stones that hummed with Force energy, yet offered no wisdom adequate to the crisis consuming the galaxy. The traditional meditative techniques that had once brought her clarity now seemed like exercises in willful blindness. How could she seek guidance from a force that permitted such systematic slaughter, while those capable of stopping it waited for clearer signs of divine will? The reports that filtered back from the war zone painted a picture of her former students, achieving exactly what she had taught them to achieve. They thought independently, acted decisively, and took responsibility for the consequences of their choices. Under Revan's brilliant strategic leadership, the Republic's forces had begun pushing back Mandalorian advances for the first time since the conflict began. Worlds that had seemed doomed to conquest were liberated. Populations that faced annihilation were saved, and the tide of war slowly turned in favor of civilization over barbarism. These victories should have vindicated her teaching methods and validated her students' decision to act against council orders. Instead, they filled her with a growing sense of unease that she struggled to understand. The Academy on Malachor V became a laboratory for exploring the possibilities of force manipulation. Unconstrained by traditional, moral, or philosophical limitations, students came seeking power and knowledge. But Chrysia's true curriculum involved teaching them to question the very foundations of their desires and ambitions. The Sith Triumvirate represented something unprecedented in the history of Force, used as a deliberate attempt to transcend the traditional master and apprentice relationship that had defined both Jedi and Sith training for millennia. Chrysia understood that the classical Sith approach constant betrayal and competition between teacher and student was ultimately self-defeating. It produced powerful individuals, but never achieved lasting transformation of the galactic order itself. Her vision required something more sophisticated, a collaboration between equals, who could challenge and refine each other's understanding while working toward shared objectives. Darth Traya's presence on Malachor V created an atmosphere of perpetual tension that served Chrysia's teaching goals perfectly. His mastery over his own death had been achieved through such complete rejection of physical limitations that his very existence challenged conventional understanding of what was possible through force manipulation. Students who came to the academy expecting traditional Sith training found themselves confronted by a being whose power derived not from anger or hatred, but from absolute will exercised in defiance of natural law. Under Chrysia's guidance, Sion developed teaching methods that complemented her own psychological approach with lessons in the transcendence of physical constraint. Students learned to push their bodies beyond normal endurance to function despite injury or exhaustion, and to treat pain as information rather than limitation. These techniques produced Force users who could operate effectively in situations that would incapacitate traditionally trained Jedi or Sith Darth Nihilus, presented different opportunities and challenges for the Academy's experimental curriculum. His hunger for Force energy was so profound that it threatened to consume not just individual opponents, but entire planetary populations. This ability made him extraordinarily dangerous, but it also offered unique insights into the fundamental nature of the Force itself. Through careful observation of how his power operated, Cressida began to understand the Force as something that could be drained, weakened, or even potentially destroyed. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If the Force could be diminished or eliminated entirely, then it might be possible to free all living beings from its subtle but pervasive influence over their thoughts, emotions, and decisions. The eternal conflict between light and dark that had defined galactic history for thousands of years might finally be resolved, not through victory of one side over the other, but through elimination of the underlying cause of the conflict itself. Cressida's experiments in Force manipulation during this period pushed the boundaries of what had previously been considered possible. Working with Nihilus, she developed techniques for detecting and measuring Force sensitivity in individuals, for artificially enhancing or suppressing Force abilities, and for creating what she termed echoes in the Force disruptions that could propagate across vast distances and affect entire populations. The Academy's students became unwitting test subjects for these experiments, though Cressida convinced herself that the knowledge gained justified the risks involved. Some students emerged from training with abilities that far exceeded their natural potential, while others suffered permanent damage to their connection with the Force. A few disappeared entirely, their fate known only to Cressida and her two apprentices. The most promising students were inducted into deeper levels of training that revealed the true scope of Cressida's ambitions. They learned that the traditional Sith goal of galactic domination was merely a stepping stone toward something far more radical, the complete transformation of the relationship between conscious beings and the Force. This knowledge created an inner circle of disciples who were fanatically devoted to their master's vision, though none fully understood the ultimate implications of what they were working to achieve. Communications with the broader galactic community during this period revealed the extent to which Revan's victories in the Mandalorian Wars had destabilized the existing order. The young Jedi general had returned from the conflict as a conquering hero, but reports from Republic intelligence suggested that he and Malak had been changed by their experiences in ways that troubled the Jedi Council. Their methods had become increasingly ruthless, their strategic thinking influenced by Mandalorian tactical doctrine, and their respect for traditional Jedi's limitations had eroded under the pressures of command. Cressida monitored these developments with intense interest, recognizing in them validation of her theories about the corrupting influence of power and the inadequacy of traditional Jedi training to prepare individuals for the moral complexities of real-world leadership. Her former students were discovering the same uncomfortable truths about the nature of authority and control that had led to her own transformation into Darth Traya. The establishment of communication networks between Malachor V and other sites of Sith activity throughout the galaxy allowed Cressida to extend her influence far beyond the confines of the Academy. She began recruiting agents and allies from among disaffected Jedi, ambitious Republic officials, and survivors of the Mandalorian Wars who had lost faith in the institutions that had failed to protect them. These recruitment efforts revealed the extent to which the galactic community had been traumatized by recent events. Entire populations had been displaced. Traditional authorities had lost credibility, and millions of beings were searching for new sources of meaning and purpose in lives that had been shattered by war. Chrysia recognized this widespread disillusionment as an opportunity to plant the seeds of a philosophical revolution that could eventually encompass the entire galaxy. Her agents worked subtly to undermine confidence in both Jedi and Republic institutions, not through obvious sabotage or terrorism, but through careful cultivation of doubt and cynicism. They spread rumors about Jedi hypocrisy, Republic corruption, and the futility of trusting in authorities who had proven incapable of protecting their citizens when protection was most needed. These efforts required patience and subtlety, but they gradually created a climate of opinion that would prove receptive to more radical alternatives. The development of new Force techniques during this period focused particularly on methods for detecting and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities in potential targets. Students learned to identify the hidden fears, desires, and resentments that motivated their opponents, and to use this knowledge to achieve their objectives without resorting to obvious coercion or violence. These skills proved invaluable for infiltrating and manipulating existing power structures throughout the galaxy. Chrysia's own abilities continued to evolve as she explored the deeper mysteries of Malachor V and incorporated knowledge from ancient Sith texts into her personal practice. She developed techniques for projecting her consciousness across vast distances, for manipulating the perceptions and memories of other beings, and for creating complex illusions that could deceive even other Force users. These powers made her an increasingly formidable opponent, but they also isolated her further from normal human experience and emotion. The philosophical framework that emerged from the Academy's research challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of good and evil, freedom and determinism, individual autonomy and cosmic order. Students learned to see the traditional conflict between light and dark as a false dichotomy that served only to perpetuate the Force's control over conscious beings. True liberation, according to this new doctrine, required rejection of both extremes in favor of a path that transcended such limitations entirely. The Academy's influence began to spread beyond Malachor V as graduates returned to their homeworlds, carrying these revolutionary ideas with them. Secret societies formed among Force-sensitive individuals who had become disillusioned with traditional training methods. Underground networks developed to share forbidden knowledge and coordinate resistance to orthodox authorities. The seeds of what would eventually become a galaxy-wide challenge to the established order had been planted and were beginning to germinate. Despite these successes, Chrysia remained troubled by growing tensions between her two apprentices. Sion's contempt for physical weakness put him at odds with Nihilus's hunger for the life energy of others, while Nihilus's indiscriminate consumption threatened to destroy the very populations. They sought to rule through strength and intimidation. Their philosophical differences reflected deeper contradictions in Sith doctrine that Chrysia had hoped to resolve through her alternative approach to training and education. The betrayal came not as a sudden shock, but as the inevitable culmination of forces that Chrysia had set in motion through her own teaching methods. She had spent years instructing Sion and Nihilus to think independently, to question authority, to trust their own judgment over the dictates of tradition or hierarchy. In pursuing these lessons to their logical conclusion, her apprentices had begun to see their master herself as an obstacle to their continued development and the achievement of their individual ambitions. The years following her exile from Malachor V transformed Chrysia's understanding of existence in ways that no amount of academic study or philosophical speculation could have achieved. Stripped of the Force abilities that had defined her identity since childhood, She was forced to navigate the galaxy as an ordinary being dependent on intelligence, cunning, and sheer strength of will, rather than supernatural power. This experience opened her eyes to aspects of reality she had never seen before, blinded as she had been by decades of Force sensitivity. Her first months as an exile were spent in the lower levels of Nar Shaddaa, the smuggler's moon, where beings could disappear into the urban chaos without anyone asking about their past. The transition from Sith Lord to anonymous refugee was more jarring than anything she had ever anticipated. She lost abilities that once felt like second nature, sensing the emotions and intentions of others, influencing minds, perceiving danger before it manifested. Gone in their absence, she discovered something surprising capabilities that had been dormant for years. Her natural intelligence, no longer augmented by precognitive insight, became sharper and more focused. Her understanding of psychology, stripped of Force-enhanced empathy, grew more precise. And most important of all, without Force impressions clouding her vision, she began to perceive patterns and connections with startling clarity. The criminal underworld of Nar Shaddaa operated on principles both similar to and completely unlike those of Force users. Here, influence didn't stem from supernatural power, but from debt, obligation, fear, and mutual gain. Survival demanded a keen understanding of social hierarchies, unspoken rules, and the subtle dynamics of betrayal. These lessons taught her more about how most of galactic civilization actually functioned than any Jedi or Sith training ever had. She realized that Force users, Jedi or Sith, were a tiny minority whose powers isolated them from the real experiences that shaped the lives of ordinary beings. Their worldview was inevitably distorted. Living without the Force, Kriya saw how much her thinking had been shaped by assumptions that only applied to the Force-sensitive elite. Questions that once consumed her free will versus destiny, autonomy versus unity, suddenly felt less urgent when seen through the eyes of people who had never touched the Force. Ordinary beings had their own wisdom. Without supernatural awareness, they developed communication systems to detect danger, technologies to enhance perception, and decision-making models grounded in reason and experience. Without the Force, they still found meaning, built civilizations, and faced challenges with resilience. Kriya began to reconsider everything she once believed about power and virtue, wisdom and the Force. In her exile, she took on many roles while staying hidden from those who might recognize her. She mediated labor disputes, relying on her grasp of human motivation to resolve tensions. She became an information broker, trading insight for survival. She even served as a teacher in refugee camps, helping people rebuild lives shattered by war. Each experience gave her new perspectives on the impact Force users had on the galaxy. Many remembered the Jedi with fondness, but others, those who had suffered as collateral damage, viewed them with suspicion. The Sith were almost universally feared, though that fear was often mixed with bitterness. Some survivors of Sith conquest spoke of cruelty without reason, inflicted by beings accountable to no one but themselves. Veterans of the Mandalorian Wars recalled Jedi generals making decisions that cost thousands of lives in cold calculation. These testimonies gave Kriya a painful understanding of the human cost of decisions made by Force users, decisions often viewed only in abstract terms. As she gathered intelligence from a growing web of contacts, she learned of the fates of her former apprentices. Sion had established himself as a warlord, sustaining his rule through sheer terror and repeated defiance of death. Nihilus had become something even more terrible, a black hole in human form, consuming whole worlds with his hunger for force energy. Survivors described him draining the life from entire planets in moments, leaving nothing but silence. In her isolation, Kriya began to understand the bitter irony of her teachings. She had sought to free the galaxy from the limits of Jedi and Sith dogma, and in doing so, had helped create even worse monsters. Sion's obsession with willpower and Nihilus's boundless hunger were logical conclusions of her philosophy, twisted into extremes. So she began to consider something radical. What if the Force itself had to be removed from galactic life? What if the solution wasn't greater power or better training, but the elimination of the Force entirely? Her observations of ordinary people supported this idea. They had built worlds, created art, solved complex problems, and formed deep relationships without any connection to the Force. She began to seek allies for this impossible goal. Rumors eventually led her to the one being who gave her hope it could be done. The Exile, a Force sensitive who had been cut off from the Force completely and survived. This person, known only as the Exile, offered proof that it was possible to exist without the Force. Kriya tracked the Exile across the galaxy, arranging a meeting through careful manipulation. When they finally met on Paragus II, she disguised herself as a frail old woman seeking safe passage. Her purpose wasn't just secrecy, was to see whether this person had truly broken free of Force dependency or simply found another way to tap into it. What she discovered exceeded her hopes. The Exile moved through the galaxy, creating what Kriya called echoes, disruptions in the Force that spread and influenced others. They didn't draw power from the Force. Instead, they generated influence through will and presence. They weren't being manipulated by the Force, but could still shape the lives of others connected to it. So she joined the Exile aboard the Ebonhawk under her assumed identity, using the ship and crew as a laboratory for study. Each companion offered new insights. Aton Rand, the former Sith assassin, began to awaken to Force sensitivity through his interactions with the Exile. Visasmar, Amira Luca, had to confront the limits of a life dependent on Foresight. Bodor, an engineer racked with guilt over the massed shadow generator, demonstrated that technology and morality could replace supernatural strength. On Telos, they saw a planet struggling to rebuild, a metaphor for galactic restoration. On Onderon, political manipulation met practical governance. On Dantwan, the aftermath of Malak's destruction revealed the ingenuity of those left behind. Each mission pushed the Exile to grow, forced the crew to change, and provided Kriya with more data. She manipulated conversations, asked questions with no clear answers, created scenarios that tested leadership, empathy, and morality. Her teachings had evolved. No longer the rigid master she had once been, Kriya was now a weaver of experience, shaping paths not through commands, but through choices. And the Ebonhawk became a model of what the galaxy might one day become, community built not on Force bonds, but on trust, cooperation, and mutual respect. All the while, her conviction deepened. The Force was the true enemy. Every conflict, every tragedy, every manipulation traced back to its influence. The Exile proved that beings could live without it. But to bring that possibility to the galaxy, something far greater would be required, a cataclysm powerful enough to sever the Force's grip on all life. The journey's final destination was Malachor, the place where it had all begun. As the Ebonhawk descended through the planet's broken atmosphere, Kriya felt the dark side pressing down, but now she saw it differently. What had once felt like strength now revealed itself as manipulation trauma, masquerading as power. The academy she had once built had changed. Scion had reshaped its structure. Nihilus had filled its halls with the energy of his feeding. The entire place throbbed with force energy, now so saturated it distorted thought itself. Malachor had become a black heart, corrupt, alive, hungry, and when she met Scion again, she saw how far he had fallen. His body bore the marks of death and resurrection. Each cycle of pain stripped away his humanity and reinforced his will. He was no longer fully alive, but something worse, a creature that refused death out of spite. Wielding his immortality like a weapon, the stage was set. The philosophies of three Sith, Lord's will, hunger, and rejection, would soon clash in the heart of the dark side. And what came next would decide the future of the galaxy. The confrontation with Scion served multiple purposes in Traya's overall strategy. On the surface, it appeared to be a simple battle between a former master and a rebellious apprentice, a familiar pattern that had played out countless Sith history. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated demonstration designed to show the exile the ultimate futility of power based on force, manipulation. No matter whether that power came from the light or the dark side, Scion's defeat didn't come from superior combat skills or stronger force techniques, but through psychological manipulation. Traya exploited the fundamental contradiction in Scion's approach to immortality. His refusal to die was, at its core, motivated by fear specifically. The fear that all his pain and suffering had served no greater purpose. But when Chrysia convinced him that his death could serve her greater goal, freeing the galaxy from the Force's manipulation, his will to continue living finally crumbled. The encounter with Nihilus presented even greater challenges and even greater opportunity. Her former apprentice had become something far beyond what she had ever imagined when they worked together at the academy. His hunger had become so vast, so all-consuming, that he had turned into a wound in the Force itself, a void that devoured cosmic energy without giving anything back. His very existence proved something that few had dared to imagine, that the Force could be damaged, weakened, and even destroyed through extreme acts of will and technique. The battle with Nihilus revealed the full scope of what Chrysia had spent all these years working toward. The exile, by their very nature, someone who existed outside the Force, was the perfect weapon against a being who relied entirely on devouring it. When Nihilus tried to feed on the exile's life force, he found nothing he could consume. What he encountered was something he simply couldn't process, a kind of existence, immune to his hunger because it operated on completely different principles. The defeat of both of her former apprentices cleared the path for Traya to finally reveal her true identity and purpose to the exile and their companions. The facade of the harmless old woman dropped away, replaced by the full presence of someone whose understanding of the Force and its grip on galactic civilization had evolved far beyond the Jedi or Sith. Her explanation of the plan she had been crafting for decades challenged everything her listeners thought they knew about the galaxy. The Force, she revealed, wasn't a benevolent guide or even a neutral tool. It was a form of cosmic tyranny, an invisible puppeteer that reduced every conscious being to nothing more than a dancer, forced to move to its rhythm. And the evidence for this, it was all around them, right there on Malachor V, where the traumas of the past still influenced thoughts and behaviors thousands of years after the events themselves. The plan she had in mind required the exile to make the ultimate sacrifice. Their unique nature would allow them to create a massive disruption in the Force, one strong enough to free every conscious being from its control. But it would likely cost them their life. This wasn't a choice Traya could make for them. Her philosophy was based on the idea that true freedom only comes when individuals take full responsibility for their choices and their consequences. The moral complexity of the decision reflected everything Crisia had learned about teaching, manipulation, and what it meant to foster real independence. She could offer the exile her reasoning, her observations, her vision, but she could not force them to accept it. That would betray everything she stood for. What followed wasn't just a debate. It was a revealing conversation that showed just how deeply the exile had absorbed the lessons from their journey. They questioned not only the plan's feasibility, but the very assumptions behind it: freedom, consciousness, responsibility. If galactic civilization had developed under the Force's influence, what would happen to those achievements once that influence was gone? This challenge forced Crisia to clarify her philosophy more than ever before. The Force, she argued, corrupted everything. It replaced personal ethical growth with cosmic guidance, removing responsibility and opening the door for endless conflict. Jedi, Sith, it didn't matter. The Force manipulated all of them. The choice facing the exile now was the same one Crisia had faced years ago when she first began to question the Jedi. Would they accept a comfortable illusion, or would they pursue the painful, difficult truth? The lightsaber duel that followed was unlike any in Force history. A battle between two beings who had transcended old ideas of power. Crisia wasn't fighting just to win, she was trying to teach one final, crucial lesson about strength, weakness, and what real courage looks like. Every strike of her saber, every use of the Force, was calculated to push the exile toward the realization that true victory wasn't about might, it was about wisdom, responsibility, and sacrifice. The exile's approach to the fight reflected how much they had grown. They didn't rely solely on lightsaber skills or Force powers. Instead, they used everything they had learned from their companions: Aiton's tactical thinking, Boja's engineering knowledge, Visa's spiritual insight, and the leadership they had cultivated through painful choices. Their style wasn't Jedi, wasn't Sith. It was something new. And in that, Crisia saw the proof that her teachings had succeeded. The exile had become someone who could cross boundaries and combine ideas. Someone who wasn't bound by the artificial walls that separated traditions and ideologies. They were proof that beings could reach their full potential without the cosmic strings of the Force. As the duel progressed, Crisia began revealing what she called prophecies, not visions, but reasoned projections based on observation and understanding. These glimpses into the companions' futures were both a distraction and a lesson. Aiton could become a Jedi who bridged the light and dark, using his past as a Sith assassin to prevent future conflict. Visas could teach her species new ways to perceive reality, ways that weren't dependent on foresight. Bowdor could use his skills to create technologies that empowered ordinary beings, not just Force users. Each future, she revealed, depended on personal choices, on free will, not manipulation. That was the heart of her philosophy. The final phase of the confrontation wasn't physical at all. It was philosophical. Crisia made her final case for why the Force had to be destroyed, drawing not from theory, but from a lifetime of experience and careful observation. The exile listened and responded. Their questions went deep. They didn't just challenge parts of her plan. They questioned the very foundation it rested on. What if she was wrong? What if removing the Force also erased something essential to life, to consciousness, to meaning? The intellectual duel that followed was more intense than any lightsaber duel could have been. Two minds, two philosophies, tested to their limits. Both teacher and student, both challenger and ally, trying to find truth together, and in the end, the resolution wasn't about one side defeating the other. It was about recognition, acknowledging that both perspectives came from the same desire, to free the galaxy from endless conflict and manipulation. Traya admitted it. The exile had done what she could not. They had found a way to maintain independence without rejecting all guidance. They could recognize wisdom without surrendering autonomy. Their final choice reflected that. Instead of destroying the Force completely, the exile chose a path that would preserve connection but eliminate its coercive elements. It was a compromise, a synthesis of both philosophies, something neither of them could have achieved alone. Traya's acceptance of this outcome wasn't a failure, it was a victory. Her student had surpassed her, and that, more than anything, proved her teachings had worked. In her final moments, Traya wasn't bitter. She wasn't afraid. She was satisfied. She had helped shape someone capable of changing the galaxy for the better, and that was enough. Her final words weren't instructions, they were wisdom. True education, she said, wasn't about giving answers. It was about helping others ask better questions. Real strength wasn't about gaining power. It was about using it responsibly, even at great personal cost. Her death didn't mean the end of her vision. It was its ultimate fulfillment. The echo of her final act would ripple through the Force not to destroy it, but to reshape it, and the exile would carry that transformation forward. The silence that followed her passing was like nothing Malachor V had ever known. For millennia, the planet had echoed with pain, trauma, and dark energy. Now, something new spread from its core. A quiet, hopeful resonance. The exile stood in the aftermath, feeling the shift. The Force wasn't gone, but it was different now. Less invasive, less manipulative, something closer to a tool than a tyrant. Something beings could choose to engage with or not. The companions aboard the Ebonhawk each felt the change. In their own way, Aton found clarity. He finally saw how his talents could be used to help people, not just control them. His dark past was becoming a source of healing, not shame. Visa's Force sight began to evolve. She could now see the true essence of beings beyond illusions, beyond influence. Her people would no longer be prey to manipulation. Bodir felt his guilt lighten. The tragedy of the mass shadow generator no longer defined him. His knowledge would now help people build instead of destroy. Even the crystal caves beneath the academy began to resonate differently. They no longer amplified pain and rage, but now seemed to echo with hope, compassion, and peace earned through effort. As the exile made one last walk through those ancient corridors, they reflected on everything Traya had taught them. Lessons learned not through lectures, but through lived experience. Wisdom earned through hard choices. The ship that would take them away from Malachor V wasn't just a vessel, it was a symbol, a continuation of a journey that had begun when they chose to take responsibility for their actions, to act with conscience, not convenience. The galaxy they were returning to would be changed not by war, not by power, but by philosophy, by choice. The changes initiated by Chrysia's final sacrifice would take time to fully manifest, but the seeds of transformation had already been planted in the choices made by countless individuals who, in the days to come, would find themselves just a bit more capable of independent thought and authentic moral reasoning than had ever been possible under the old regime of cosmic manipulation. Worlds once devastated by the endless conflicts between Jedi and Sith would begin to rebuild, not according to doctrines imposed from above, but by following the values and needs of the people who lived there. Cultures that had long been suppressed or pushed to the margins during the era of force-wielding elites would finally find the space to thrive, adding their own insights and contributions to the broader fabric of galactic civilization. Technologies would gradually shift as well designed not to deepen dependence or concentrate power in the hands of a gifted few, but to enhance natural abilities and encourage self-reliance. Over time, these tools would begin to replace systems that had long been focused on serving those with supernatural gifts. Academic institutions, those that would eventually rise in place of the old Jedi temples and Sith academies, would reflect this new ethos. Their focus would be on critical thinking, ethical reasoning, and practical skill building, rather than cultivating force powers that had long separated students from the lived experiences of ordinary beings. Teachers, too, would be measured by a different standard, not by their command of cosmic energy, but by how well they helped others discover and nurture their own unique potential. Political systems across the galaxy would slowly evolve as well, moving toward a greater respect for local autonomy and cultural diversity. The urge to forge galactic empires built on uniformity and centralized control would begin to fade, making room for more flexible, collaborative forms of governance that acknowledged the complexities and differences between worlds and species. Of course, none of these transformations would come easily. There would still be challenges, setbacks, and resistance. Habits shaped by millennia of manipulation wouldn't vanish overnight. But for the first time in generations, a real foundation had been laid for something different. A galactic civilization rooted not in domination or cosmic authority, but in principles that respected both the dignity of the individual and the responsibilities of the collective. The exile's role in all of this would not be grand or loudly celebrated. They would not lead movements or build institutions. Instead, their influence would be quieter, subtle, but profound. They would become a living example of what was possible, that one could live wisely and compassionately without the need for supernatural powers or external authority, that one could lead by example, not command. Their presence would inspire not because of fame or prophecy or charisma, but because of how simply and honestly they had lived. Their legacy would ripple outward, not through conquest or ideology, but through the quiet inspiration they left in their wake. As their ship finally left Malachor V's gravitational pull and entered hyperspace, the world they left behind began its own slow process of healing that had only become possible through Chrysia's final act. The dark side energies that had choked its air and poisoned its soil for so long began to fade, slowly neutralized by the echo she had created. In their place, balance began to return, not a forced harmony, but a natural one. A world allowed to breathe again. The stars above, which had watched silently for millennia as beings fought and bled and sacrificed in the name of cosmic ideals, now looked down on something different. On planets where beings were finally beginning to make choices based not on fear or anger or power, but on reason, compassion, and genuine care for one another. The eternal war between light and darks, so long the central drama of galactic life, was beginning to give way to something deeper, a quieter, more personal journey, the ongoing effort to understand and resolve the real moral complexities that came with being conscious, imperfect, and alive, and in the quiet moments before sleep. All across the galaxy, beings would find themselves no longer dreaming of battles and prophecies and powers they could not control. Instead, they would dream of things far simpler and far more powerful, of fulfilling work done with care, of relationships built on trust, respect, and love, of slow, steady change that made life better for everyone. And those dreams, quiet, ordinary dreams, would prove more powerful than any vision. They would shape the future more deeply and more lastingly than any Jedi or Sith ever had. And in those futures, somewhere in the echoes of thought and hope and memory, lived the dream Chrysia had seen at her most insightful and at her most human.